Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The Iranian deputy foreign minister has said that Iran is aware that elements are trying to put America into a war with Iran for their own goals. This, of course, referring to John Bolton, the national security advisor to the Trump administration, who is currently in the region trying to whip up furor against Iran, apparently over his allegations, I should say, that Iran was behind the attacks on the oil tankers in the United Arab Emirates. Now, this comes at the same time that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, is traveling across Europe, seemingly to countries such as Switzerland and Germany, which have relations with Iran. Is he trying to figure out backdoor diplomatic means to get to Iran through such means and through such talk? Oman, Iraq, Qatar, and Japan have at this time been the countries that have offered to mediate and to ease tensions between the United States and Iran. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Raffaele Mauriello, who is an adjunct professor in geopolitics and global security of the Sapienza University of Rome. He's also co-director of the International Relations and Islamic Studies Research Cohort. He's joining us now from the Iranian capital, Tehran. We're also joined by Abdoun, who is a geopolitical analyst. He specializes in Middle East and North African region. He also publishes perspective articles analyzing geopolitics, security, and the economy, and the risks related to all of that, and how it impacts the Middle East, North Africa region, specifically also energy markets. He is joining us now from Brussels. Anas and Raffaele, thank you both for joining us. Raffaele, you're in Iran itself, so I wanted to get your thoughts. What is the feeling there right now about Bolton's visit to the region and then also Pompeo's then visit to Europe? It's sort of mixed signals, isn't it, from the Trump administration?
Yes, of course. I think you can explain it easily looking at the real, the value of the real against the dollar, because that really tells you about how Iranians are preoccupied or frightened by, the U.S. administration or not. And recently, in the very recent days, the real has got 11% back value against the dollar. That means that Iranians don't take Bolton seriously right now, neither do take seriously Pompeo. There is preoccupation in general in the country among Iranians, mostly related to economic issues, but no one right now is taking seriously the idea that will be possibly a war between Iran and the United States or Iran and Saudi Arabia. People are waiting, are preoccupied because of the economic sanctions, but Iranians are very resilient, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is very resilient. So basically, people have been preoccupied, but now they take it more easily because after some months, after the imposition of sanctions, after the new way of sanctions at the beginning of this month, people have been accustomed to how to deal with them. And generally speaking, although the pressure, the economic pressure is high, generally speaking, you still find any good that you want in the market. Of course, prices have skyrocketed, but the situation, generally speaking, is fine, I would say.
Anas, what do you make of that? Because, if we're looking at Bolton, and he has quite a track record, if I may say that, because, he was involved in pushing for the Iraq war. He has relations with the Mujahideen Khalq terrorist organization, which is obviously an anti-Islamic Republic organization. Also, he's a man who has a lot on the line, doesn't he, if there were to be any war with Iran?
Yeah, I think it's clear that John Bolton is pretty on the conservative side and is pushed for a more harder confrontation against Iran. The fact is that the American strategy is not clear, because before that, Pompeo said they made a hard pressure on Iran because he wanted to negotiate on a 12 demands. But every serious analyst will tell you that it's impossible for Iran to accept these 12 demands, and even one of these 12 demands. So now the American strategy is in a deadlock, and they create a crisis without knowing how to get out of it. I think Iran doesn't want war, and I think even like Donald Trump doesn't want war, but there is some external actor, and Bolton is one of these actors, but also some like Israel, Saudi Arabia, who push for the harder line. But now I don't think we are very close to a military confrontation. Of course, there is a risk because we have a lot of troops in the ground very close together. I mean, in Strait of Hormuz in Iraq, And because there is no direct talk between Tehran and Washington, the slightest incident can have huge consequences. But there is no goal for both sides to arrive at that step.
Okay, so Raffaele, we're looking at the Iranian point of view here. We know that President Rouhani has said that, listen, if the Americans lift some of those harsh sanctions, we may be willing to talk to an extent. But then Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, has said that we will not be talking to the Americans at all because there's simply no benefit to it. That's also mixed signals, isn't it, from Iran?
To a certain extent. In this respect, Iran is very much reflects politics in the United States. You always have conflicted signals. That is both a policy, I would argue, and a reality on the ground. Both countries have very complex political systems, so you have contradicting opinions, but also contradicting postures. What is true is that, of course, the leader of the head of state in Iran, Ali Khamenei, can say that now there is no value from the Iranian perspective to have diplomatic discussions with the United States of America unless the United States of America comes back within the deal, and then perhaps Iran and the United States can have a global discussion about regional issues. What the president is stating is also true in the sense that, generally speaking, the Iranians have always been open to discussion. The point that from the Iranian perspective, this discussion has been balanced and credible, and now Trump is not considered a credible partner for discussing diplomatic issues by Iranians in general. It's not just the leader, it's the whole population that thinks that Trump is not reliable as someone you can, close a dealing, and then the day after it will come out of the deal. So he has already done that. And now what he's saying is that he just wants Iran does not develop weapons of mass destruction, and Iran is not developing such weapons. So what's the end goal? This is one of the reasons Iranians and myself don't see a war coming, because there is no plan, no end goal. The policy from the United States is very confused. The policy from Iran, actually, from my perspective, is very clear and open. We have discussion if discussions are serious.
Anas, what do you make of that? Think that the Iranians should take a step forward? Who do you think really whose court is the ball in at this time? The Iranians would say, obviously, the U.S. is the one that needs to be the one lifting the sanctions and respecting the nuclear deal, which, of course, the U.S. would not do. Or do you think that the Iranians need to be the ones bowing down here?
It's actually a tough position for Iranian right now, because, of course, it's the root of this crisis starting with when Washington leaves JCPOA agreement. It's pretty difficult for Iranians to trust now the American administration, because there was an international agreement. United States and European countries signed that agreement. It wasn't perfect in European perspective, but no international deal actually perfect. The difficulty right now for Iranian is try to deal with this huge economic pressure. They can't leave the JCPOA agreement because they afraid that European will join the American diplomacy of sanction, and in the same time they can remain in an agreement when they pay that agreement. I mean, they stop their nuclear program, but they don't have any benefits, and the Iranian economic situation is even worse than before this deal. So I think the strategy will be defined
So Anas, if I may stop you, do you think that there's any value of Iran even staying in the deal? Because I imagine many people within the country in Iran are questioning, listen, our economy is going down the drain. What's the point of staying in the deal?
I think currently the Iranian strategy is just to wait, to manage and waiting the next American election to hopefully get a Democrat administration, and then to try to retalk with a Democrat administration. There is no point right now to stay in the deal, because even the European instrument like Instex, which is basically kind of barter trade deal, doesn't work, because banks are afraid to invest in Iran, and companies are afraid about the extraterritoriality sanction. But the situation, it's not a good situation for Iran, but they can even be worse to leave this agreement. So there is no win perspective for Tehran right now.
Raffaele, what do you make of that? Because I know you travel back and forth between Europe and Iran quite a bit. So what are you hearing when you're in Europe itself about the deal? Do you think that the Iranians will hold on? Do you think the Europeans can really do more to preserve this deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Europeans should do more. Can they do more? That's the key question. I can tell you that they are trying and they really believe that they are keeping the deal. But from my perspective, I've been discussing a lot with the European diplomats. Actually, Europe should do more because according to the deal, Europe is not only party to the deal, it's also the one that guarantees the deal. And actually, Europe, it sounds strange, should have imposed sanctions against the United States when the United States went out of the deal. That would be Fanta politics. But still, it's reality. The other problem that I see is that Europeans think, what I was listening from my colleague from Brussels, that the Iranians will keep the deal until the elections. But that is not the case from my perspective, because what I see as a bottom line from the Iranian perspective is to sell 1 million barrels per day. That is the minimum acceptable from the Islamic Republic point of view. And we have gone down that number. So if Iran cannot sell at least 1 million barrels per day, they need to act. So one of the things they could do is get out of the deal, but they need to act. This is why Rouhani announced that they're scaling down the commitment of the JCPOA, because they cannot simply wait. They can be resilient, but there is a minimum of acceptance of that resilience. And in this respect, Europe must do more. And we have seen interesting things, and China must do more.
But then, Raffaele, I imagine this is a risky game for Iran too, isn't it? And especially the Rouhani administration, who came into office really on the back of this nuclear deal and wanting this nuclear deal to go forward, A, and then B, the fact that it remains in place. Because I imagine that the Europeans, if Iran walks away from the deal, would just impose sanctions once again?
It's difficult to say, because also the situation in Europe with recent elections has been changing a lot. We have Merkel leaving basically as head of the informal head of the European Union. She's getting out of politics in the long run. We had important elections with important changes. We have the problem with Brexit. So I don't know what will happen. What I can tell you is that from the Iranian perspective, we also have elections in Iran next year. So if Rouhani doesn't do anything, you will see the result in the elections in Iran. So in addition to looking at what is going on in Europe and what will happen in the United States with the presidential elections, Rouhani also has in mind that in Iran there are elections. If it doesn't show to have a strong head, it will end up as previous presidents, just forgotten. Where is now Ahmadinejad? Where is now Khatami? Rouhani is, from my perspective, smarter as a politician than Ahmadinejad and Khatami. He looks for the long run, and he wants to have a place when he will leave the presidency of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I think that he must act. There is a problem that Iran doesn't have so much maneuver, so they will try to move within this range of maneuver. The Europeans are important. Again, from my perspective, I've been insisting a lot from this perspective. We are really, as the Europeans, losing respect in Iran in general among also the population. And, China and Asia are gaining up. It's not the best thing in general, but I think as Europeans, we should do more. And we might see, because of the general economic war between the United States and China doing something. And we have witnessed them doing it.
Okay, so Anas, I wanted to go back to some of those accusations that John Bolton has put forth. He says that naval mines almost certainly from Iran were to blame for the damage to those oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. That, of course, occurred earlier this month. He's even saying that he will present some sort of proof and evidence to the United Nations Security Council soon. Do you think the U.S. really has proof? Do you think that the Iranians would really want to attack oil tankers in the UAE?
Well, currently we don't have any proof or evidences behind this attack in the Fujairah port. But what's important to say, and I want to emphasize on that, it's how symbolic the attack was, because the Fujairah port is actually outside of the Strait of Hormuz. And the UAE authorities built this port linked into a pipeline in Habshan oil field in Abu Dhabi to try to decrease their dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. And a few days after, we have this drone attack in a Saudi oil pipelines from Yemen and Houthi rebels backed by Iran. So all this context can be interpreted as a message, as a clear message, as we said before, an Iranian message to say if some countries in the region pushed for a harder position against Iran or pushed for a direct confrontation against Iran, there is a heavy price for all the region, and there is no evidences, but it's hard to believe in a coincidence in these two attacks in the same week.
Okay, so Raffaele, what do you make of that? That regardless of even if there is proof or not, do you think that the message though has been received by the region and by the world that Iran is not to be messed with?
Of course, have been fully received. I think there is no evidence, and it will be almost impossible to have evidences Iranians are smarter than that. But the point here is that what they've shown is that what anyone knows, that Iranians have indeed the capabilities to close the Strait of Hormuz. That is a reality. The Gulf, although, when you look at Al Jazeera website, on kind of that website is called the Arab Gulf, that is propaganda because it is the Persian Gulf. The Iranians know the Gulf very well. They control the Gulf. They know how to act, and they can close the Strait of Hormuz. I will be back with what I was saying. They have a minimum of acceptance of pressure. They are accustomed to pressure. They can deal with pressure, but there is a minimal level of acceptance. And this is why you saw so many reactions from Iran, the pulling out of part of the agreement, those accidents. We don't know who did them. Although what is clear is that what anyone knows, that you have to respect the fact that Iran is a regional powerhouse, like it or not. So if you want to have a Strait of Hormuz where everything is fine, when you have the oil coming out, anyone should have the capability of selling the oil. And among them, Iran. Iran won't accept others selling oils, taking his place, like Saudi Arabia has been doing, and not acting. So they should expect that. Actually, from my point of view, the US administration political stance is reckless, not what Iranians are doing. Iranians are simply trying to protect their interests in the region. The other actors are pushing Iran to be more aggressive, but I don't think that's a good policy decision.
Do you agree with that, Anas, that the U.S.'s policies towards Iran are reckless? Because, we can obviously add on a lot of the rhetoric that we've seen, even just by Donald Trump even, about Iran, ever since he's been just candidate before he even became president. But then recently, just over the past week and a half, he changed his tone, didn't he, when he was standing beside, I believe it was the Japanese leader, and he said that, listen, we respect the Iranian leadership, et cetera, we want to talk to them, and, we respect the Iranian nation, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you think that there are these major mixed signals, even just from the president of the United States?
I think initially some advisors, and especially like John Bolton, advised Donald Trump that after protests that happened in the end of 2017 in Iran, we just have to make an extra sanction, an extra economic sanction, and then the Iranian regime will be weakened. And now they see that the thing is more complicated than that. The Iranian society is very resilient, and the American strategy now is in deadlock. So they try to change and they try to find out how to get out of this crisis by create some canal of communication. But like I said, right now the communication canal between Washington and Tehran passed through the Swiss embassy in Tehran. There is no direct talk, and they try to decrease this crisis that they initiate, and that's why the strategy now, even for analysts and academics, is very difficult to understand because it's basically unclear.
Okay, well, we'll leave there as our final, gentlemen, and the clock has gotten the best of us. But of course, we appreciate both your time, your insight and analysis. We thank Anas and Raffaele. Raffaele speaking to us from Tehran, and Anas was speaking to us from Brussels. And now, viewers, as both of our guests, they're put into context, There is a lot on the line here, of course, but the Iranians have sent a message. Whether they did it intentionally or unintentionally, obviously, the proof is yet to come out. But let's just for a moment presume that Iran may have been behind this, or at the very least has sent a message somehow to the region and the world. That message has been received, seemingly. Donald Trump as well has seemingly changed his tone now as well, not necessarily just connected to these attacks on these oil tankers, but just overall, seemingly putting a more conciliatory tone, if I may use that term, towards the Iranians. But at the same time, John Bolton now in the region stirring up more rhetoric against Iran while Pompeo is in Europe. These mixed signals, very confusing of what's to happen next, but a lot of people downplaying the possibilities that a war is actually looming. This, of course, as half of Americans, mind you, actually believe that a war with Iran is coming soon. That's according to a recent Reuters poll. We'll keep that all in mind here in Scope, and we'll keep a close eye on it as well. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope. Well, children are being racially abused every hour in the United Kingdom. That's according to research that has come out of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, known by its abbreviation NSPCC. Police data have shown that babies even and toddlers have been among victims of more than 10,500 crimes recorded in the 2017 to 2018 time period. That's an average of approximately 29 such crimes every single day. Children even as young as 10 are whitening their faces to avoid racist abuse in the UK. That's according to a child protection group. Police saying that they're struggling against this rising tide of hate crimes against minors. To discuss all that a bit further, we're now joined by Anjum Peerbacos, who is a co-founder of Advancing Voices of Women in Islamophobia. She's joining us now via Skype from London. We're also joined by Martin Lennon, who is an education worker with Show Racism the Red Card. He's joining us now via Skype from Glasgow. Martin and Anjum, thank you both for joining us. Anjum, I'd like to start with you. There's no other way to put it, but this report is certainly quite disturbing that even babies and toddlers would be victims of racist abuse. What do you make of that?
I mean, that's absolutely horrifying and shocking to hear that children of such a young age and such a tender age would be exposed to and be victims of what we can only describe as overt racism. And it is a real concern. And we need to really start asking some key questions about how this has been allowed to happen and in which kind of environment and culture we are creating for future generations where this has become either normalized or acceptable.
And why do you think it has become normalized or acceptable, Anjum?
So the report has stated that there's been an increase in the last 3 years, and I'm not quite sure if you're aware of the current political climate in Europe at the moment and in the UK. And given the rise we've had in the kind of far right nationalism to some degree, and what is very intolerant sentiment towards migrants and people of colour or people that are different has definitely increased in the UK where the Brexit campaigns were run. And I think there is a correlation between that movement and that political climate and also what we're seeing here in this report. And I think there needs to be a lot of work done as to why this has been allowed to happen and why it has become more of an acceptable premise within the society where even children are feeling this way.
Martin, what are your thoughts on that? You're in Scotland and that you work with an organization that works against racism in general. So what are your thoughts about why this is occurring and how disturbing, of course, it is that children even are being subjected to this?
Well, I'm in total agreement about how disturbing this report is. And when I saw the details of it, the idea that even toddlers were being subjected to it, it really kind of sends a shiver down the spine. But unfortunately, none of it's particularly out of kilter with the kinds of things that we see in the classroom when we are discussing issues of race or immigration or particularly Islamophobia in the UK. I think definitely what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years in the UK is that what were previously quite widespread but unspoken forms of racism have kind of been given a permission structure to really become overt and overtly stated. Yeah. The other participant mentioned the Brexit referendum, and it's undeniable that there was a spike in racist incidents immediately after the Brexit referendum, and it's not subsided ever since. I think there's definitely been a kind of a culture of permissibility where people whose views were previously seen as like not being socially acceptable, not being part of the political or social mainstream, have felt that they've been legitimised in their feeling, primarily by the Brexit referendum, but also by a kind of a creeping culture of demonising immigrants and those taken to be immigrants in the UK over the last 10 years. We just saw the resignation of the Prime Minister last year, but if you think about her political legacy and the kind of policy she was implementing in the Home Office, a lot of it was to overtly demonise people, not just who were immigrants, but people who are assumed to be immigrants because of the colour of their skin or their religion or their culture.
Indeed. I want to add another voice to this question. We're also joined now by Ms. Arzu Merali now, who is a writer, researcher, and human rights campaigner. She's one of the founders of the IHRC, the Islamic Human Rights Commission. She is joining us now from London. Arzu, thanks for joining us. Arzu, what do you make of this report specifically? A, how disturbing it is, and B, what does this mean for a country like the UK, which really depends on multiculturalism and having immigrants come in, high-skilled immigrants, that is, to be able to, to continue to have a strong economy going forward?
Well, I think I'll take your second question first. High-skilled, low-skilled, the UK needs both of these, actually, and it's been in a kind of extreme denial about its needs versus this rising kind of hyper-nationalism that we've had accelerating now. I think your previous speaker said over the last few years we've had this kind of spike in hate attacks that kind of coincides with this hyper-escalation of nationalism, which was sort of burning away anyway at maybe at less rapid pace beforehand. And so you have every other day in right-wing broadsheet press stories like, well, there has to be some kind of fix on the visa system to allow X or Y type of high-skilled labour in. But despite the sort of Brexit flag-waving kind of jingoism that we've got, we still are left with the problem of the fact that we need the low-skilled labour as well. Yeah. This kind of idea has been very much debunked in circles which listen to logic that actually, less foreign workers means more jobs for the British. It's not the case. It's not been like that kind of ever in the last sort of 20, 30 years.
Right. So
we need people the jobs that British people don't want to do.
Yeah. And then, Arzu, I wanted to ask you then about the children in this case. They're certainly learning it from somewhere. Do you think it's politicians at fault here, or is it just home environments where I imagine then parents are speaking about other cultures and negative connotations?
It's a combination, but even that home culture is ultimately influenced by what politicians say, what's being seen on the television, on mainstream media, by the messages that having laws which disproportionately target Muslims or black people, or a kind of a legal immigration system that so clearly demonizes people trying to come into the UK, who are of different cultures, and that extends from Muslims, people of colour, to Eastern Europeans. All of that is imbued by all of us actually living in this country. We're all internalizing it in one way or the other.
Yeah.
And ultimately, children are more vulnerable,
Indeed,
and more susceptible to those ideas being kind of, relentlessly thrown at them, as are their parents. I mean, it's shocking when you look at the figures, but I can guarantee you this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are children who are phoning up helplines. The majority of children experiencing this will not report it. And
Indeed.
I wish I could say it was shocking, but really I think anyone working in these fields will probably say, we're not surprised.
Anjum, I wanted to bring you back in, and I want just to put to our viewers, and you may have already read this, Anjum, in the media, but one of the children that called Child Line, I believe it is the number that for the helpline. A 16-year-old Muslim girl, I'm quoting her now, said that people call me a terrorist and keep telling me to go back to where I come from. I dress in traditional Muslim clothes, and I think it singles me out. I usually just put my head down and get on with it, but it's getting to the point now where I genuinely feel like I might get attacked. end quote. And that last part really disturbed me personally. That any child, any 16-year-old girl of any background really would say something like that. What do you make of that, Anjum? Do you think that this really will now only get worse, that this will genuinely then translate into some sort of actual violence?
I mean, we have seen an increase in hate crime, verbal abuse and physical violence towards Muslim women in particular, actually. And if we look at the statistics post-Christchurch, and there was a spike of 593% of hate crime reported after that incident, and a large proportion of that was targeted at Muslims.
Isn't that paradoxical? I'm sorry for interrupting you, Anjum, but that's paradoxical, isn't it? Because Christchurch was an attack against Muslims.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what's happened is that actually, although it was against Muslims, what it's done is it's emboldened people of the view that Muslims are not part of our larger society and don't belong within the fabric of society, and has given them a kind of credence and credibility that they didn't have before. And they have become emboldened and feel like what they're saying and doing is justified because they've seen an example of it in such a public forum because it was posted online. And I think that the rise in attacks against people of colour, but in this case in particularly against a Muslim young girl, is something that we need to address, and is something that worries us all. I know through my own personal experience that as a Muslim woman wearing a hijab, that I am, very, very aware about the decisions I make daily about how I'm going to appear in the public domain. Am I going to be using public transport? Where am I going to go where it's going to be safe to take children? These are all now things that I've had to consider that I haven't had to consider previously. And I've been born and raised in London. Right. And London, I would say, to some degree, is a bubble because it's such a multicultural and such a diverse society. But even I'm having to consider those things now. So I do think that there is a concern. And particularly with this young girl that you've mentioned, I worry about her well-being. I would worry about what kind of aftercare there was after she'd made that call. That's a cry for help. And about her physical well-being, but also her mental well-being. These are very, very impressionable young people. And I think that what's going to become of that, what's the aftermath of her having made that phone call, and what support is in place for that young girl and others like her who haven't been brave enough to make that phone call.
Indeed. We're just going to go into a very short break now. All three of you to stay with us, though. We want to continue this conversation exactly on that point that Anjum ended there off on about the impact that this will have. We'll discuss that right after this break. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. We're still here with Arzu, Anjum, and Martin. Martin, I wanted to start off with you in this segment. I want to ask you about that point that Anjum made there before we went to break, about the impact that this has on children. Long-term as well, of course, but not just, and of course, just right after they experience any sort of such abuse. I don't want to just make this about, just Islamophobia, but certainly that's a huge aspect of all this. But, there were even within the Childline, calls that came in, Childline has said that there were children of other Asian descents who also then had concerns about, for example, the way they looked. So we had a Chinese girl, for example, who said that she didn't like the way she looked because she'd been bullied so much, and then she tried to wear makeup such that she would make her eyes look bigger, et cetera, et cetera. Or there were children of color who tried to make their skin look whiter or fairer than it originally is. What kind of an impact do you think, Martin, this has on society and then the next generation, really?
Well, I think it can have a potentially very devastating impact, particularly on the young people concerned. I mean, if we think about all of our experiences as young people in schools, we're learning how we can relate to the community that we're a part of. We're learning how we can relate to other people, and if a huge part of your formative years is going through this period of increasingly emboldened overt racism, then the lesson that you're really taking away is that maybe who you are isn't going to be acceptable, and you maybe have to change either your appearance or your behaviour or other aspects of your identity. I can't imagine anything more troubling or more kind of personally damaging to someone's personal development than that. Although I would say that although this report's very discouraging and disheartening, at the same time there is a kind of a growing movement against racism in the UK, and as as racism kind of becomes seen to be more socially acceptable, becomes more prevalent, I think more and more people are realising, or maybe realising that what had existed kind of beneath the surface for a long time never really went away. And so the reaction to that, whether it be within the teaching profession or within education more generally, we are an anti-racist education charity, and we receive like a huge amount of support from all of the major teaching unions in the UK, as well as the other trade unions, and as well as kind of public figures. And in particular, we're kind of themed around football and the work of individual footballers, whether it's Raheem Sterling and how he's responded to the racial abuse he's seen or that he's experienced. I think the beginnings of a reaction against this and a real fight back are kind of in the offing, and so.
So do you think that Martin, that initiatives such as yours then are getting enough support from the government, most importantly, because of course credit to those who are fighting against racism, such as yourselves, and even as you mentioned, the teachers' unions that support you. But I imagine that without the backing of the government, these sorts of initiatives can't be as impactful as they may be.
Well, certainly not. I mean, we're very grateful for the support that we get from trade unions, from football clubs, from ordinary members of the public, and from kind of civil society more generally. But the support of the UK government certainly has been, kind of marked by its paucity. There's an ongoing programme in the UK of austerity and of kind of cutting back local authority budgets, or cutting back what are seen as kind of unnecessary elements of the public sector. But what's seen as unnecessary by the people in power, generally speaking, it's the things that are improving the lives of the most marginalised. And anti-racism work and like educational work that kind of broadens people's horizons and emphasises inclusion. Quite often we find that that's the first place that the axe is going to fall. So absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Arzu, I want to get your thoughts on that. But I imagine education is extremely important in this case, isn't it? What teachers are talking about in their classrooms, what textbooks are saying about other races?
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to the other panelists here, I can't see the pictures. I think I'm probably a good generation older than both of them. So I kind of remember when, as a child, going through this in the 70s and 80s, and we were certainly not the first generation of people of color, Muslims. In those days, we were just all called ourselves black, to go through this. And so I understand, and I also obviously work in anti-racism. I've just completed a 2-year project funded by the European Union between Islamic Human Rights Commission and University of Leeds, looking at countering Islamophobia, what counter-narrative can be levied, what's already being done on the ground. So there is an awful lot going on, especially in terms of civil society and in terms of support from, unions and other progressive parts of society. However, I think, unfortunately, we're not even in the situation of when I was growing up because of many factors. You've mentioned schools, and I think institutionally the education system in the United Kingdom at the level of schools is really in free fall. It's in free fall just in terms of its own existence and structures and standards, etc. And within that free fall, there hasn't been any systematic way to address what you just mentioned, representation in textbooks, in curricula. So you have curricula, for example, in history and English, which just excludes different cultures, full stop. And on top of that may include text and imagery that is actually quite racist. So, and teachers with the best will in the world often, inadvertently reproducing racist stereotypes. Now, when you're in that, you're sort of promoting that. You are, overtly and inadvertently and also implicitly furthering the problems and the cultural code, the environment that children are growing up in, that, when something happens, kids snap, there will be hate attacks. Indeed. So, we are not really far enough down the road here. And I do feel a little bit pessimistic about things probably getting a bit worse before they get better, because we don't have that either civil society space, the voices that are allowed to be heard in anti-racism now, or civil society generally are really sort of very few. We have such a climate of demonization by a kind of unrelenting right-wing swing in the mainstream media as well as in government, that really very few dissenting voices are given air. Everybody else is characterized as a radical, an extremist, a terrorist, pro-terrorist, etc. For the most, for campaigning about the environment, forget about issues of racism. So.
Okay, so let me put some of those points, if you allow me, Arzu, to Anjum, because Anjum, of course, I want to get your thoughts on the education factor, but I'm also thinking just purely from a capitalist point of view as well, if I may use that term, for a country like the UK. I imagine it's a bad thing to have children at this young age have such prejudicial views, ingrained into them, because these are the future CEOs, these are the future employees of, respective companies across this country. How will they be acting then as adults? That's worrying, isn't it? Because then that would be a bad thing, certainly for the economy, because we all know that minorities and immigrants and others, they give a lot back to their respective economies too.
Absolutely. And I think I completely agree with some of the issues that have been raised previously. Schools are at breaking point currently. And the tragedy is that the current government has brought in measures of austerity that have hit hard in areas of maybe schooling and funding that have affected these extracurricular things that we need to consider. However, I absolutely agree curriculum needs to change in a way that children of all backgrounds can identify with what they're seeing, because if you can't see it, then you don't understand that that is a normal, acceptable face to either see in a curriculum, in a textbook, in a novel that you're studying. If you go through a 14-year period of your school life and you never see anybody that you can relate to or that fits your bill or your face or your experience, then that is racism by exclusion. And I think there are lots and lots of strides that need to take place in order to fill that gap and that void. Curriculum is definitely one of them. But let's not forget, we're currently in a climate where the government has decided to bring in austerity measures where schools are absolutely strapped for funding at the same time where their policies have brought in things like go-home bans, the Windrush scandal, which took place under this current Tory government, and the prevent strategy, which has been brought in with the previous government, but has become statutory under this one. And I just think these are all things that are policy and legislation and institutionalized levels of discrimination, if you like, that have been brought in. And I think they need to be addressed at government level because they're having such a wide impact and bearing on so many people of colour, and not just people of colour, but any immigrant that comes to this land, is affected by this. So you are looking at, the Eastern European community that have come over and have been able to service those labours and those skills and those areas of work in particular fields that the current population or the existing population wouldn't want to do. And they provide a service, and that needs to be acknowledged. But also migration is not a new phenomenon to this island. We've had migration here and migrants here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that needs to be on the curriculum. That needs to be studied so children as young as primary age understand that actually every wave of migration has brought a skill and expertise, an area of development that we didn't have here before.
Anjum, I'm going to interrupt you. I do apologize because the clock is getting the best of us. So if you allow me, get the final word from Martin. Martin, I want to get your thoughts on that. On of course the contributions of immigrants and other minorities to the UK, of course, in general, and of course we can talk about the economy and otherwise also. And I also wanted to ask you, Martin, about these other strategies of the government, such as Prevent and others that have been spoken about by Anjum. How detrimental do you think those are?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think the contribution that different communities and people with maybe various identities make to the UK society, really can't be understated. I totally agree with everything that's been said previously by the other two contributors, but I worry that they were almost kind of being a bit reductionist at the same point. It's not just the economy that benefits from an influx of people from different cultures or with different skills or different world outlooks. The UK society would be totally unrecognisable were it not for the different waves of immigration and the different cultures that have thrived here from different periods of time, whether it's the cuisine or kind of theatre or cinema or music scene or anything like that, the contributions that have been made from to these like elements of national life from multiculturalism like really can't be overstated. So while immigration is important for the economy, just for the kind of like collective life of our community, it's so much more important than even just that.
Okay, and Martin, I'm gonna stop you there. I do apologize, but that's a very good point to end off this segment on. We of course appreciate Martin, Anjum, and Arzu for their time and their insight, and for talking to us today here in Scope. As Martin there ended off, viewers, it's not just about the economy, and of course, I kept bringing that up just because I think that from a government point of view, that may be something that would at least they would connect with at the very least. But of course, as Martin there said, cultural contributions as well to the UK. It just makes it a more bright place. A vibrant place to live, doesn't it? As in with any multicultural society. But of course, it's disturbing, these reports about children being targeted by racial abuse of any sorts across the UK, those numbers increasing drastically, and children even then taking drastic measures to use whitening makeup to change their skin color, or just saying things like they don't like the way they look at such a young age, or a 16-year-old Muslim girl saying that she genuinely does not feel safe anymore. Is that right? Is that what the UK wants to be going forward? We'll leave that for our segment, but before I sign off, I just want to thank, of course, my team here at Scope for, of course, this 100th episode that we are celebrating today here at Indus News. Their contributions, of course, behind the scenes are vital, and this show cannot go on and could not have gotten to the successes that it has today without their contributions. So, of course, a loud thank you to all of those team members here at Scope. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you for watching.